Her shadow split into two. It happened at 11:47 p.m. According to the stove clock, she hadn't reset since the last outage. The apartment was quiet in the way only upper-floor units could be, suspended above the world, buoyed by insulation and distance. A single lamp burned beside the couch, its shade the color of old linen, casting a honeyed circle across the hardwood floor. Beyond that circle, the living room dissolved into gradations of gray. Mina stood barefoot near the coffee table, phone in hand, rereading a message she'd already answered. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen, a low mechanical breath. Somewhere outside, tires whispered across damp pavement. Pipes ticked in the walls as they cooled. Her shadow lay long behind her, stretched toward the hallway, tapering over the baseboards and up the pale paint like a stain. She shifted her weight, and her shadow did too. But not all of it. At first she thought it was a trick of the lamp, maybe the bulb flickering, filament stuttering. The light had been unstable for weeks, pulsing faintly when the AC kicked on. She looked at the shade. Steady. The glow was warm and constant. She moved her hand experimentally, lifting it to her face. One shadow hand rose with hers. The other lagged half a second behind. Mina froze. On the wall, where there should have been one silhouette, there were now two. They overlapped at the feet, fused at the ankles like roots sharing soil. From there they separated cleanly, two torsos, two heads. One mimicked her perfectly, arm bent, phone near cheek. The other stood with its arms hanging loosely at its sides. The refrigerator hummed on. Her throat tightened. "Okay?" she whispered to the room, as if addressing a skittish animal. "Okay." She lowered her arm. The first shadow lowered its arm. The second did not. It remained still, head slightly tilted, as if listening. A car passed outside, headlights slipping through the slats of the blinds. For a moment, light from the street layered across the living room, introducing a second angle, a second cast. The shadows multiplied and blurred, and then the headlights were gone. One shadow remained faithful. The other had shifted closer to the hallway. Not much, just inches, but enough. The lamp had not moved. Mina had not moved, and yet the second silhouette had drawn itself subtly toward the darker part of the apartment, where the hallway light was off and the bedrooms sat in closed silence. Her heart began to pound, each beat loud in her ears. She turned slowly, watching the wall. The faithful shadow turned. The other stayed facing forward. Now it was clear. It wasn't merely delayed. It wasn't misaligned. It was independent. She stepped back. The hardwood floor gave a small complaint beneath her heel, a soft creak that seemed louder than it should have been. The curtains stirred in the faint draft from the vent, brushing against the window pane with a dry, whispering sound. Her two shadows detached completely at the feet. The faithful one slid with her, maintaining the proper geometry of light. The other peeled away like oil separating from water. It stood upright on the wall, a darker absence within the dimness, and took one deliberate step toward the hallway. The lamp flickered then, once, a tremor in the filament, and the second shadow slipped around the corner. Mina didn't scream. The absence of sound felt like a rule she couldn't break. As if noise would validate something, invite it further. She snapped on the hallway light. White illumination flooded the narrow corridor, harsh and flat. The framed prints along the wall, abstract shapes she'd bought at a thrift store, suddenly looked unfamiliar. The baseboards were scuffed in places she didn't remember. The air smelled faintly of dust and something colder, like metal. There was only one shadow now, her own, cast directly beneath her, compact and obedient in the overhead light. She laughed shakily. "Stress," she murmured. "Too much screen time." The apartment had always had its moods. A settling creak at night, a low knocking in the pipes during winter. Once, she'd sworn she heard someone pacing in the unit above, only to learn it had been vacant for months. Places remembered previous occupants. That was all. Residual impressions. She turned off the hallway light. The lamp's warmth reclaimed the space. Two shadows stood behind her again. This time, the second was closer. It leaned toward her shoulder, its head near her own, as if confiding something she couldn't hear. Her skin prickled. She could feel it, an awareness like standing too near someone in an elevator. Not touching, but close enough to sense their breath. "I don't feel that," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she meant. The second shadow lifted its hand. Mina's hand remained at her side. The silhouette's fingers reached toward the wall, pressing against it, and the paint seemed to darken under its touch. The refrigerator cut off mid-hum, plunging the apartment into a deeper quiet. Without that low vibration, the silence thickened. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and uneven. From the kitchen, a faint glow bloomed, the refrigerator light flicking back on as the motor restarted. But the fridge door was closed. Cold white light spilled across the tile and edged into the living room, creating a third angle of illumination. 3 shadows now. One true, one cast by the kitchen, and one that belonged to neither source. That third shadow stood slightly apart, darker than physics allowed, its edges too crisp. It wasn't aligned with any object. Faced her. Her pulse roared in her ears. The second shadow, the wrong one, turned its head toward the kitchen glow, then toward her, and it smiled. Not a smile she could see in detail. There were no features, just a distortion of outline, the curve of a head bending in a way her own could not. Her reflection in the dark TV screen caught her eye. Only one body stood there, but in the glass, she saw 2 silhouettes behind her. The second one did not match the angle of the light. It stood closer to her back than possible, its head hovering just over her shoulder. Her reflection's shoulders were tense, but the shadow in the glass looked relaxed. Relieved. A memory surfaced then, not an image but a sensation. The first night she'd moved in, standing in this same living room surrounded by boxes. A faint impression that the apartment was not empty, that it was waiting. She'd laughed at herself. Now the wrong shadow took a step forward. Mina felt it before she saw it. A lightness at her heels, as if something were lifting her weight from the floor. She looked down. Her faithful shadow was fading, thinning at the edges. The wrong one was thickening, darkening, solidifying with each breath she took. It raised its arm. This time her arm followed. Not by choice, not consciously. Her hand lifted slowly, palm turning toward the wall. The sensation was subtle, like following a cue you hadn't heard, like muscle memory that wasn't yours. "No," she whispered. The word felt distant, as if spoken from the end of a hallway. In the TV's reflection, her body moved a fraction of a second before she did. She tried to step back. The floor resisted. The wrong shadow stepped forward. Her body mirrored it. The lamp flickered again, and for a heartbeat the room went dark. In that darkness, she felt a shift, a sliding sensation, as if 2 transparencies had been misaligned and suddenly clicked into place. The light returned. The living room was unchanged. The lamp steady, the refrigerator humming softly, the blinds still. Mina stood near the coffee table, phone in hand. Her shadow stretched long behind her toward the hallway. Only one. She exhaled, a tremor leaving her lungs. "It's fine," she whispered, and the words sounded natural again, grounded. She walked to the hallway and flicked on the light. The white illumination flattened everything into familiarity. On the wall, her shadow stood compact and obedient beneath her. She turned her head slightly, testing the motion. The shadow followed perfectly. In the dark TV screen, her reflection smiled faintly. Relieved, at ease, she turned off the hallway light and returned to the couch, settling into the cushions. The fabric felt softer than before, welcoming. The apartment's hum wrapped around her like a blanket. In the corner of the room, near the ceiling where the lamp's glow barely reached, a faint thinning began to form along the paint. Pale outline. Not dark, light, as if something had been removed, as if a shape had been taken out of the room and never put back. And in that empty space on the wall, where her original shadow should have stretched, there was nothing at all. The ceiling fan spun faster when she got anxious. It had always been subtle at first. A whisper of movement in the air, the soft whir of the blades increasing ever so slightly when her mind tensed. At the start, Emily had dismissed it, nerves after long workdays, or perhaps her imagination. But now, sitting on the edge of the sofa in her dimly lit living room, she felt it again. A faint vibration through the ceiling, a shiver of air brushing her neck. She glanced up. The fan spun lazily above her, the brass edges catching the warm glow of the table lamp. Shadows wavered across the walls in slow, uneven patterns, and the motion made the familiar space feel unsteady, as though the room itself had begun to breathe. A car passed outside, tires whispering over damp asphalt. The apartment was otherwise silent. Her fridge hummed a low, consistent note from the kitchen. The radiator clicked softly. The air smelled faintly of laundry detergent and the lingering scent of chamomile from the tea she had poured earlier. Emily's hand trembled slightly as she set her mug on the side table. She wasn't nervous, she told herself. Not tonight. And yet, the fan had already begun to accelerate, a quiet whoosh beneath the lamp's glow. It pulsed faster when she thought of the email she hadn't sent. The words she'd typed and deleted and typed again. The image of her inbox swelling with unopened messages. The shadows from the blades started to twitch on the ceiling, sharp slivers racing across the walls. She felt a cold draft crawl along her arms, brushing the skin where her sweater left gaps. Her pulse quickened, and with it the fan's speed. The blades cut through the room with a faint, metallic rasp now. Emily exhaled, willing herself to calm down. "It's just a fan," she whispered to the quiet room. "It's just physics." She concentrated on the lamp light, the warm halo it cast across the sofa cushions. The fan slowed slightly but not fully. It hovered in a restless middle speed, like it knew she wasn't being honest with herself. Her shoulders tightened, a spasm she didn't notice until she felt the small gush of air brush her neck again, and they were climbed, sharp and insistent. She pressed the palms of her hands into her thighs, attempting to anchor herself. A shadow leapt across the ceiling, splitting her reflection in the glass of the picture frame on the wall. Her reflection shifted with the blade's movement, a fragmentary echo of her form, fragmented and angular. She imagined it smiling at her from the warped light, a small, crooked grin. The next night, Emily noticed the fan spinning faster before she had even begun to feel anxious. She was reading in bed, mind calm, when the blades suddenly picked up, humming with quiet urgency. Startled her. She sat upright. No draft had touched her. Her pulse was steady. And yet, the fan's motion pressed against the air like something alive, deliberate, continued in the following days. It responded to her thoughts before she voiced them. The worry about unpaid bills, the memory of her brother's scolding voice, the fear of missing an appointment. Each micro-anxiety caused the fan to accelerate in imperceptible increments, almost predictive. Emily began to notice the shadows along the walls, the streaks across her ceiling and curtains. They flickered and pulsed in rhythm with her unspoken dread. By the end of the week, she could no longer ignore the sensation of being watched. She began to feel it whenever she sat alone. A pressure above, like the air itself was observing, recording, cataloging. She tried reasoning with herself. She was tired, overwrought, a little paranoid, but the fan refused ignorance. One evening, while she was cooking, she paused mid-stir. She hadn't realized she was worrying yet, but the fan was already spinning faster. Her eyes darted upward. The shadows it cast raced along the walls, curling over the cupboards, stretching across the counter in ribbons of darkness. She hadn't felt anxious, hadn't even formed a thought about the dinner she was preparing, but the blades pulsed against the air as if they anticipated the tension before it arrived. A faint whistling joined the rhythmic chopping sound from the knife on the cutting board. She stopped moving. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow deeper in the corners, like ink pooling beneath the seams of the room. The fan's speed climbed almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably, humming through the chain of air and bone. Emily fled to the bedroom. She shut the door and turned on the small desk lamp. Shadows still moved on the walls, elongated and sharp. The fan's rhythm had become uneven, pulsating, almost conversational. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to drown out the hum, but it seemed to pierce through the skull itself. Sleep came fitfully, accompanied by the whir above her head. When she awoke in the early hours, the fan had slowed, almost still, but the air in the room carried the faint metallic tang of anxiety, as if it had absorbed her fears in the night. Gradually, Emily began to notice the fan reacting to more than just her anxiety. It spun faster when she imagined something unpleasant, even if she didn't let the thought fully form. When she recalled memories she preferred to forget, the blades hummed almost imperceptibly in response. When she tried to distract herself with reading or music, the fan resisted, oscillating subtly, forcing her awareness upward. A few nights later, she noticed something else. When she walked from one room to another, the fan seemed to tilt the shadows across the floor in anticipation of her movement, casting her own silhouette ahead of her steps. The effect was faint at first, almost optical, but it became undeniable. The room's familiar shapes, the dresser, the bookshelf, the desk, seemed less familiar, distorted. It was no longer a room she occupied. It was a room that observed her. The final escalation came without warning. Emily was standing in the living room, alone, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. She hadn't felt anxious for hours, yet the fan roared, blades cutting the still air with authority. She froze, staring upward, and realized the shadows on the walls didn't match her position. They shifted independently, stretching in ways that defied the geometry of the room. One shadow lingered directly over her favorite armchair, waiting, attentive. A draft brushed against her cheek, though the windows were closed. A whisper of movement swept across the walls. She held the cup in front of her like a shield, the ceramic warm against her fingers. The fan's speed oscillated wildly now, responding not to her emotions, but to something unseen, above, deliberate. Emily stepped backward, toward the hallway. The blades seemed to slow as she approached the doorway, almost cooperative. She realized, with a pulse of horror, that the fan wasn't reacting. It was communicating. Every hum, every tilt of shadow, every subtle increase in speed, it was purposeful. It had been studying her, recording her anxieties, anticipating them, learning them. Her own body had become predictable, mapped into the rhythms of the ceiling fan above. A flicker of thought, a memory she hadn't thought about in years, crossed her mind. The night she'd moved in, she'd felt a strange sense of being watched. The fan had been there then, too silent, still unnoticed. And yet, perhaps it had been spinning all along in a way she couldn't perceive, charting her presence. Emily realized she was no longer alone in the apartment. Something had ascended into the blades, into the shadows, into the air she breathed. It had been patient, waiting for her patterns, her rhythms, the faint spikes of anxiety she didn't even recognize. It had learned her. The fan slowed slightly, as if approving her comprehension. The shadows coalesced over the armchair, solidifying into a darker form that mimicked the shape of her own seated body. Her pulse raced, then stilled. She had been mapped, anticipated, studied, and now the apartment would never let her move freely again. As she turned her eyes upward one last time, the fan began to spin faster, not in response to fear, not to her thoughts, but to her recognition. And in the steady hum of the blades, Emily understood. The fan was no longer a machine. It was a presence, patient, observant, waiting, and it had finally decided she belonged to it.